Hi guys, it's Dream and today I'm gonna give you an advanced course on blur on Funimate. Now I've already added my picture here and going to keyframe and add effect and selecting the blur option, you can see we have multiple blurs such as channel, directional blur, Gaussian blur, lens blur, median blur, MiniMax blur, radial blur, sharpen, tracking blur, unsharp mask, and zoom blur. Now, I'm gonna explain each of these and present them to you. But the most important kind of blur in all edits is motion blur. Now, you can find motion blur on transform and scrolling down. What motion blur is, it's basically, it blurs the picture when it moves in a certain type. So for example, if I create a position keyframe, so my picture goes to the right, just like this, you can see the faster the picture moves, the more blur it is applied to it. So it's basically like an automatic blur, and it makes your edits really smooth, and it's really crucial. So I really recommend using motion blur. It's very important in all edits. Now going back to the other types of blurs actually, we have channel blur, which is basically a blur that is placed into different categories so that you have green, red, blue, and it blurs out in that kind of color scheme. Now, if you use all of them at once, you're gonna see it creates a normal blur, because when they're all at the same value, it actually creates the normal blur. Because what channel blur is, it's the normal blur, but it has different values for different colors. This is a really good blur for effects like glitch and stuff like that. Now on the next one, we have directional blur, which is a blur that you can use in whatever direction you like. You can change the angle and the intensity. Now the next one is Gaussian blur, which is really used. It's like a bokeh effect in real life. It's the blur that basically blurs out everything. Now the next one, it's lens blur. Now lens blur is similar to Gaussian blur, but it actually simulates a real-life lens. It's like seeing the picture through a real-life lens. You can see the effect it creates and the way it looks. You can also select the gamma behind the picture, so it looks more illuminated or less illuminated, just like this. Now lens blur is really good for velocities because it looks really smooth and creates a professional effect. Median blur is similar to Gaussian blur, but it has this paint effect. You can see it looks like the picture is getting painted, just like this. Now the next blur on the list is MiniMax Blur. Now MiniMax Blur has different shapes, such as square or linear. Now you can also change the angle, and this one, it's like a lens blur, but it actually has squares, and they're pretty similar, but you can also choose different colors for it to blur out on. You can choose the type of blur to create different effects, such like this one, which is a paint effect. Now the next blur is Radial Blur, which is basically a rotation blur that you can choose with intensity. You can also change the type, so it rotates the picture, or it goes straight away, just like this, or it's centered, or rotate fading, where the rotation blur fades into the picture. A scratch effect, which means it scratches the surface of the photo. And fading, which is like this. Now the next blur is Sharpen, but this one is actually used for quality and improving your quality, so we're not going to talk about this one. Now the next blur is Tracking Blur. Now what Tracking Blur is, it's basically a motion blur, but it's a little more advanced. You can select an intensity for what positions or scales or rotations you want, and it actually looks better than motion blur, and you can use this to do the same effect as motion blur, but it does look a little better. Now the last blur on the list is Zoom Blur, and Zoom Blur, it's basically where it blurs as a zoom in transition, just like this, creating a zoom-like effect. Now that's all on blurs. There are a lot of options to make your edits really interesting, and you have a lot of opportunities with blurs.